want to take it just to thank everybody for being here. Again, thank everybody for taking time. I know these are trying times, I think, for all of us in lots of different ways, and it's an opportunity for us to get together and just talk through what it means to be a leader in this time and share some ideas. And Mr. Bartlett and I, Mr. Bartlett's the other gentleman that's on video at the moment. By the way, I should probably stop since we're recording and say, hi, I'm Dolan White.
Introduce ourselves.
Good protocol, good practice, right?
So,
Mr. Bartlett?
Yeah, I'm Blaine Bartlett. We've got a mix of folks here from different lists, colloquially here. Dolan and I just, like I mentioned just a moment ago, rapid iteration, rapid prototyping here. Let's just kind of put this out there and see what we can do with it. For those of you that don't know me, just a very quick overview of what I'm bringing to the table in this conversation. I've been studying the field of leadership and actually working in the field of leadership development for, going on the better part of 4 decades right now. I have learned some stuff, and I have forgotten a lot of things that a lot of people haven't learned yet, but we'll play with that. The point that I want to make with this is that what we're going to be talking about from my perspective is very practical. It is my experience of what works from a leadership perspective. And I've got a very specific definition of leadership that we're going to be organizing around, which is that leadership is the activity of co-creating coordinated movement. And it's got those 2 pieces to it, co-creation and coordinated movement. So partly what we'll look at as we start exploring the 7 points that we're going to be illuminating here is how do these elements of co-creation and coordinated movement come into play with that. So just in terms of finishing the background here, adjunct professor at Beijing University. I'm on the teaching faculty of the American Association for Physician Leadership. I work with a group called MEDI. We actually coach executives in the C-suite and hospital systems literally around the world, but around in this country in particular. I've written 4 books, actually 5 books now, one of which you're going to have access to here in just a minute. I got to know Dolan about 3 years ago, 4 years, actually a little bit more than that.
Somewhere around there, yeah.
And he's attended a couple of my leadership programs, and we've actually become quite good friends and collaborators. So, Dolan, a little bit about you, real quick.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well, again, welcome everybody. I am Dolan White. I have about 30 plus. I don't have 4 decades of experience, but mostly because Blaine's a lot older than I am, and but I have about 30 years, give or take a nickel, inside of the software industry, leading large teams, managing large complex implementations, doing M&A. I spent about 3 years pretending I was an attorney inside of the body of a very, very large, prominent software company. Last 4 years, I spent my time as chief executive officer for a very successful digital marketing firm. So I approach this, and now similar to Blaine, I'm doing coaching and consulting, and that actually working with other organizations and helping them scale and grow. And kind of similar to the comments that Blaine made, one of the things that concerned us and kind of what kind of launched this conversation we'll have today really was this is the moment in time where being a leader and leading through this challenge that we're facing with the event. We'll talk about a Black Swan event as we go along, is even more complex and more difficult, especially as we're leading remote teams and people that are in turmoil. So today's conversation really is to kind of deal with that. I know you guys are going to all be disappointed. We have no slides, just no PowerPoint slides. We're going to have a conversation. At the end of the conversation, Blaine and I hope to go about a half hour, 45 minutes. And then we want to have a Q&A either in the chat, or if you could raise your hand, we'll take you off mute so we can have a conversation. But we're here for as long as you guys would like to, as you all would like to chat. But that's the intent. On the call, the topics are, we're going to talk about mindset and leadership. There's 7 things. So the first topic is mindset and leadership. We're going to talk about clarity and candor. We're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the 80% rule. maybe a couple of minutes, maybe longer. Blaine and I can wander off in the bushes pretty easily. And then we're going to talk about that this is not a Q2 problem. This is a Q3, 4, Q1, Q2. This is a bigger problem because this is a substantive reset on how we have to think about business and how we have to think about leadership. We're going to talk about liquidity first, which is something I think that's important for everybody from a decision factor and how you think about your businesses and things you should be focused on. How to stay close to your client, just some tips and ideas around staying close to those folks. And then the last topic is adapt or die, which I think is, we're all kind of in that mode, I think universally, as all companies are in that mode. So we're going to end that, and then we'll shift into a kind of an open Q&A. So if you give me a raise your hand if those topics sound interesting, and just wave at us, and then we're gonna get started. And yeah, thanks, you guys. Thanks, good. And we're gonna get started. So I think the very first place that when Blaine and I were talking about it was just about the twins of mindset and leadership, and how closely they're buckled together, and what that really means.
Yeah. So just to kind of pick that thread up, first of all, just the nature and notion of a black swan event. Made an assumption that everybody's probably at least familiar with the term, but very quickly as a definition, a black swan event is something that occurs that is unprecedented and unexpected at the point of time that it occurs. I mean, it just takes everybody by surprise, and it disrupts and completely turns upside down anything and everything that we're dealing with in our lives. And this pandemic, interestingly, I was doing some research. You go back in time, and I'm going to take us back literally to the year 165, when Marcus Aurelius was the emperor in Rome. There was a pandemic that was spawned out of China that ended up moving across the entire globe, ended up claiming the lives of about 20 million people eventually. It lasted for 15 years. And it was Marcus Aurelius's basically, what would be the word I'd use here? It was his trial by fire. I mean, he was at the time considered, when he was moved into stepped into the role of emperor of Rome, one of the considered to be one of the least prepared emperors to have stepped into that role, and became probably the most preeminent emperor that Rome ever had. He was a fundamental foundation of what became Stoic philosophy. His writings, and many, particularly meditations, are profound. And I'm going to read a quote here. And this was from his diary, The Meditations. "A disease like the plague can only threaten your life," he said in Meditations. "But evil, selfishness, pride, hypocrisy, fear, these things attack our humanity." And that's where this notion of mindset comes into play, and particularly as it's part and parcel of how we approach what we're doing in the face of this thing. Leadership, I've already defined: co-creating coordinated movement. This is not a command and control exercise. You don't co-create with command and control, and you certainly don't coordinate well with command and control. And the mindset is what informs all of this. So when we're thinking about mindset, it's basically a set of beliefs, paradigms, just kind of how we think about what goes on around us, how we think about reality. And the important thing around mindset is that when you start taking a look at data, research data, roughly about 95% of all human behavior is generated out of unconscious dynamics, things that we've learned over our lives that become part of our way of thinking, and it's out of sight, out of mind. What we want to be able to do is bring it into focus, into relief, into visibility, so we can make some choices about what we do. And this is seated in the notion of awareness. The greater awareness I have about what's going on with and for me, the more choices I have about how I respond to what goes on around me. And that's really crucial from a leadership perspective.
Yeah.
So I guess, one way to approach this is you're flying on an airplane and there's a catastrophe that occurs.
Yeah.
And, the admonition has always been, if you listen to the announcements at the beginning of the flights, put your face mask on first. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about here, is how do you as a leader put your face mask on first so that you're in a position to actually work with and lead effectively the people that are in your organizations. So, the idea is, I think got some solid foundation to it.
Yeah.
When you're looking at co-creating coordinated movement, you're really looking at making some distinctions about how do we thrive, not just survive. We got to survive in this, but how do we end up making decisions that allow us and position us to thrive long term, not just survive short term. And one of the mindsets, and we'll talk about this a little bit in terms of leadership. When I'm looking at co-creating coordinated movement, I have an aphorism, and it's in the workbook that Dolan is giving you the link to. And it's put together with a little a meme called ACCCT. Leaders have to act. And ACCCT is awareness, context, communication, commitment, and trust. And these 5 elements come into play when we're looking at coordinated movement. And I want to speak specifically here to context. Context is what gives meaning in any situation, in any environment. And when you're thinking about what people are experiencing right now in your teams, in your organizations, your customers, small and large, even in our families, one default could be, this is happening to me. And that's an interesting framing, and it's a context. And when I'm thinking about this is happening to me, by definition, I've literally put myself in the position of being a victim of what's going on around me. And victims don't have choice. Victims feel as if they're being done to. Victims don't experience having agency. There's a contraction that kind of goes on with that. So you can contrast, this is happening to me, to this is happening for me. In both of these frames are made up. This is happening to me as a knee-jerk reaction because it really is a physiological response. This is happening for me has to do with me stepping back for a moment, giving pause, and then looking around. And if this is happening for me, that opens up a conversation that is fundamentally different than this is happening to me would provide. And this is the conversation that you want to be able to bring to your teams. And this is a part of beginning to shift mindset, recognizing your own mindset. If you're coming from, this is happening to me, oh my God, my hair's on fire and we're going to die, you're going to have some very interesting consequences. On the other hand, if you're going, this is happening for me, whether you believe it in your bones or not, but if you come from and act as if and start thinking from that position, you start seeing some different ways of looking at how this might be useful in a long-term play. So that's kind of where the idea of mindset and leadership come into play here. And then how we go about communicating that, we're going to look at that as we look at some of these other pieces. And then the piece of around commitment, we're going to close off on that a little bit later in this conversation, because commitment has a little bit different twist to it in the way that we look at it from a leadership perspective. Yeah. That's my soapbox, and partly what we want to do here. I'll get off the soapbox. Dolan and I want to have a conversation going back and forth around this, just dominating like I just did. So, Dolan, your thoughts, please. It's hard for me not to be. I was enthralled. You're running here.
No, it's interesting though. So I think one of the things I think that as leaders, and all of us here, and by the way, the questions that go into the chat, well, I'll come back to them. Lynn, I just saw you drop a question in there. It's a great question, by the way. When we think about where we are as leaders, I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with a gentleman, and we were talking about kind of the position this has put us in, and it's almost the thought kind of where we landed with it is this is kind of our time. This is something that we've trained our entire careers for, to lead people, to lead businesses, to lead the decision-making process, to understand how that works. And we kind of have two choices. We can either rise to the occasion, or we can hide in the closet with our toilet paper and hope that nothing, hope that nobody comes for our toilet paper. And it does create the need for us to lead from an entirely different place, and a little bit of a different mindset. Matter of fact, a little bit of a substantively different mindset. That one of the things that we've talked about is when you are, not to get specific around tactics for leading remote teams and kind of the places that we're all in, because I would imagine that probably most of you, and raise your hand if this is you, you're now trying to lead a team remotely from your home, and you're no longer in an office where you can see the team, talk to the team, be with the team. So you're leading in a remote place, and it creates a new challenge for you, not only from a leadership perspective, but from the perspective of now, how do I continue? How do I manage this feeling in my own mind so that my head's straight, my own mindset is straight, so that when I'm leading my team, I'm leading them properly, and I'm not instilling more challenges or more panic with those individuals, because it's tough. I think everybody's dealing with their own challenges and perspectives to this. So yeah. Blaine and I talked a little bit about it, and one of the things that came to mind is this is a time when one of the most important things that you bring to your team when you're leading in that perspective, not only is to have your mindset kind of squared away for you as individuals, as leaders, but be available. This isn't one of those moments where you can be available from 8 to 9 and 9 to 10 or 1 to 2. It's an opportunity for us to literally be available for our teams. Mr. Bartlett,
well, I think this is where, just the notion, and again, this is both leadership and mindset. Leadership is a relationship sport. It involves people. Yeah. So as a leader, we want to be particularly attentive to the relationship dynamic here. And I don't mean just the interpersonal relationships. As we start working remotely, people have relationships with work process, and that has been disrupted. And the problem with change is the disruption to relationships that the change causes. So you've got teams of people out there, you've got organizational interfaces, with clients and suppliers and whatnot, that the relationships have been perturbed. They've been upset. So as a leader, you want to be in a position here of attending to those relationships and making sure that they are as fluid as they can possibly be. I did some of the initial, and actually it was kind of pioneering work with remote team development when I was working with Nokia back in the 90s. And I teamed up with a woman by the name of Jessica Lipnack. And Jessica actually wrote the book on remote teams, remote team with her husband, who has since passed. But yeah, remote teams are difficult, because we're missing a lot of the cues that would typically inform how we're working together. So continual communication is going to be absolutely crucial here. And to Dolan's point, your availability will make a big difference here. And some of you listening, and I know some of you quite well, availability has never been an issue for you, and you need to really pay attention to it so that it can come through in different channels this time.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. It's one of those things, and we need to be sincere about it. So our intent from an availability perspective, and I love that word intent, right? Because it describes what it is that we intend to do, and our intent around it needs to be sincere. If we're going to be available for individuals, then we need to be available. Yeah, and we need to be respectful of their time. So one of the things that Blaine did that you touched on, and I want to go back to it just before we kind of go on to clarity and candor, is you talked just briefly about command and control. And there's one thing that you and I shared, and that is when you are command and control mode, which, by the way, I don't know if everybody's led remote teams, so there are a lot of people have the opportunity in their job to work remotely on a Friday or on a Tuesday or one day a week or one day every 2 weeks. And we're kind of adjusted to that. Some of the folks on the call that I see here have led remote teams for quite a period of time. So there's both kind of an art and science to it. But when you have folks that are accustomed to being brick and mortar employees or team members, and then now shift them to remote, there are critical things that they've got to think about. They may not have a place to work. They got to worry about their kids. They got to worry about time. They've got to impinge on each other's space. We've now got husbands and wives. I've talked to a couple of couples that were husbands and wives are competing for the same kitchen table. And so there's lots that goes on. And if you move to kind of that command and control conversation with them, one of the things that's telling that individual is you don't trust them.
Yeah.
So you have to trust your team and remind them that you trust them and remind them that you value their contribution and encourage them to be successful and recognize that it's going to take a little bit of time for them to kind of get their anchor set, because this experience isn't going to end this week or probably next week.
And actually, that's kind of I think a good lead in into the clarity and candor piece, because one of the things around clarity and candor, as you as a leader, you're going to be doing things that you haven't done before in this sort of an environment. And if part of your mindset is organized more around, I need to be able to see what's going on. I need to be able to monitor, what's going on around me. That's not going to be as present. And so, rather than, kind of, suffering in silence here, one of the things that you can do with your people is look, literally be declarative about this. It's kind of like my bias and my preference is this. I'm not getting that right now. So, here's a way that, tell me how we can work with this. And so you actually start, opening up the kimono a bit here, and just sharing. This is where feelings become really, really important to be sharing. You don't want to hold things in. And I mention this because an old mentor of mine a long time ago said, we connect through our vulnerabilities. We never connect through certainty. And in this time, your people are uncertain, number one, but they're going to be more likely to connect with you, listen to you, and work with you when you can be vulnerable about, I'm not sure about what I'm doing here. I'm making this up. I think I've got a pretty good idea of where I'm going, which actually kind of moves us to, this notion of just how do you communicate about what you're doing. And Dolan and I were talking about this a little bit. Yeah. And Dolan had an example about Mark Cuban that I thought was actually really illustrative of this particular, point about, clarity and candor.
Yes. So Mark Cuban went in to meet with the Navs and with the Mavs, not the Navs, but the Mavs, and
for those of you that don't know, Mark Cuban is the owner of
the Mavericks
basketball team. Because I know we got
the illustrious basketball fan that I am, which is I know the ball's round and there's a hoop, but I kind of passed that on out. But I was reading an article where Mark had gone in to talk to his team, and he was in front of his team and said, look, there's a 5% chance that the NBA is going to, top 10% tops, maybe 10%, that the NBA is going to shut down the games. We'll just play without an audience, and we're going to go crazy. And he walked out the door, stepped out of the locker room, and he got a text that said, hey, guess what? We just shut you down. And he was speaking empirically to this team. This is what's happening. This is what we're going to do. And lo and behold, it happened. And he immediately was in an interview with Forbes, and the comment was, well, I guess, this is the Black Swan event we all were hoping to avoid.
Yeah. And the idea with that, that story is, and I don't know that Mark did this intentionally. I think it's just kind of part of his makeup. But he was speaking in possibilities, not certainties. And when you start looking at clarity and candor as something that you lead with in this sort of an environment, you can't have certainty about what's going to happen tomorrow or even the next hour. But what you can do is, come up with your best guess and then assign a probability to it. There's about a 30% chance that this is going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then you've given yourself some wiggle room. As soon as you start declaring it is going to be this way, and then something happens that it's not this way, I guarantee
Yeah.
you, trust begins to erode, and you can't afford to have trust eroding if you can find a way to avoid it. So, speaking in probabilities, be candor about it. I don't know the answers to all this stuff, but I got a good guess, and this is what I think it is, and then you work from there.
Yeah, it's
This data comes in.
I think one of the things that, and one of the important components of this is just as I don't know necessarily everybody's households, but the news media is covering this 24 hours a day, every 60 seconds, 7 days a week, right? And you every now and then, by the way, I would suggest a little fasting. It's good to have a little fast and a little not news all the time. Just take a break, but get your mindset right. Take a break.
Intermittent fasting.
Take a breath. Yeah, intermittent fasting. But when you're a leader, I mean, we're looking to leaders in our global organizations to give us indications as to where we're going and what we're doing. So when we think of being leaders ourselves, we have those individuals that are on our teams that we help. They're same scenario. They're looking to us again to give them guidance. And when we speak in specifics in that way, we could be literally misstepping and missetting their expectation and eroding their confidence. And then there's a whole nother set of trickle down. One of the things I wanted to just touch on, Blaine, and maybe we can kind of talk about is just from the candor perspective I think this is a time where it's a great opportunity for us to practice. There's a great video on YouTube on radical candor.
Yeah, radical candor.
It's a great opportunity for us to practice candor, because one of the things that our teams will be looking to us for is candid responses or candid input on their performance and things they could be doing differently or better or change, because that's only going to help them, but there's a way that you can communicate that. This isn't the forum to have that conversation. So I would suggest that, and one of the things that Blaine mentioned, and I'll throw it out there, that I adopted years ago and branded it mine. Many people think I said this, which is the sentence of "for the sake of." And I'm gonna tee that back to you, Mr. Bartlett, because that's your thing.
Yeah, the notion of "for the sake of what." When you're asking people to do things or setting expectations. Particularly when things are really uncertain. And this kind of goes back to the notion of the context, the framing that gives meaning to what we're actually doing. The question why is a unilateral, or not a unilateral, it's an omnidirectional question. It doesn't really point to anything. But if you ask the question, or if you provide information around the question, for the sake of what? I'd like you to do this, or we need to be doing this for the sake of. Then you can fill in that blank. It gives a little bit more certainty to what it is that you're asking people to move towards. And that's the key, move towards something. And that from a leadership perspective, what is it? What's the possibility? Leadership is the art of creating possibility in people's minds. And when you're creating possibilities, then when it can drop into somebody's timeline, this possibility is now seen as possible. They are going to be more likely to move with it and actually embrace what needs to be done to make it happen than they are when they can't see it on their timeline. And I have found that the question "for the sake of what?" asked of them begins to have them think about it in a time frame, and everybody's got a timeline in their head. They think about it in a time frame that is appropriate for them, that is familiar to them, and they can answer the question, if we did this, what would it make possible? It's for the sake of what? I got it. Then they can move. And you're not forcing anything down their throats. It's an invitation to participate. It's an invitation to move. Co-creating coordinated movement. Coordinated movement is, we're dancing together. I'm not forcing you to dance the rumba while I'm playing waltz music. It's you're looking at coordination here, and that for the sake of what? Why are we doing this in this way?
Yeah,
becomes important, and and they're not going to get it right, which moves us to the 80% rule, I think.
Yeah, it does. I think one of the things. So we have so as leaders, when we're in our decision process, and have this conversation frequently, it is that we tend to want to get to perfect. We're going to make diamonds out of coal. We've got it in our fist, and by golly, we're going to get to perfect before we call the ball. Everything's going to be ready. We're going to go. This is not a time where getting to perfect can work. Even there was the very first annual report back in the old Amazon days that was issued to the board of directors, talked about, look, the goal is let's get to an 80%, basically a C plus kind of a decision process. Well, maybe maybe a B, maybe a B,
maybe a B,
maybe a B, but let's get near it somewhere, and let's call the ball. So if you're in a decision-making process, or if you're coaching other individuals and you're helping them make decisions, this is a time when you're going to have to get close enough to the decision that your instinct, your knowledge, all of the things that you've accumulated as a leader over the years and your experiences qualify you for, so that you can make that decision and move forward with confidence. Move forward clearly with confidence.
Yeah, and that's an important point, because this, I think, is where emotional intelligence comes in.
Yeah.
Moving forward with confidence. Yeah, we look at emotions here, and anger, frustration. I'll just use those two. They're kind of extremes of a certain set of emotion. They show up when people feel out of control. And I will guarantee, as a leader in this sort of a situation, you will feel out of control more often than you feel in control. And the idea of control is illusory, but it really becomes top of mind for people when they're looking for perfection, or getting as close to perfection as we can. This 80% rule makes a big difference. I'll just speak to IDEO's experience with rapid prototyping.
No, interesting.
We come up with an idea, and we don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but we come up with an idea of what something could be, whether it's a service or a product. And then we take what we have, where we're at with what we can do, and we just throw something together. And we get out there and we test it. It'll probably drop. It probably won't work. But then we get some data, and then we can come back to the drawing board with it. Your mindset and the way that you as a leader approach that, you can't be frustrating. It needs to be positioned as, we're going to learn here. There's an iterative approach here that we all will collectively learn how to do this thing in a different way. And that can be exciting. I mean, it can really be an interesting, informative way to work. Lynn Introsian just posted in the chat room here that Ford and other manufacturing firms are closing their manufacturing plants. Not surprising, given some of the stuff that's going on right now. So what do you start doing with rapid prototyping? We're not going to not do stuff, but this is where, this is not happening to me, it's happening for me comes into play. If it's happening for me, if I'm coming from that position, the idea of it's happening for us. Now, and I don't mean that from somebody's handing it to us as a gift. I mean, this is happening for us because it's allowing us to get creative. This is where innovation begins to shine. This is where we start getting inquisitive. We start looking at, doing things that we never thought we would do before, because we were trapped inside a constraint box of a manufacturing facility. Now we're outside of that constraint box. What would be possible? Art of possibility. And then you rapid prototype it, 80%, get something out there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Jim just put a comment in there. Jim is fail in a hurry, learn and grow.
In a hurry.
One of my favorite sayings, there's a direct and indirect mentors, but one of my favorite sayings is fall 6, rise 7. It's a Zen saying. But and to Blaine's point, anticipate the fact that you are going to be iterating, and you are going to be challenging, and you're going to be doing things differently. It's also, if we think back to clarity and candor, kind of back in the previous topic, that's an expectation to set within the body of your team that, hey, look, I'm going to do my absolute best to support you as a leader. We're going to experiment on stuff, and some of this stuff is not going to work, and your feedback is going to be critically important to help us decide how to do things better. So people have an input, and they have a mechanism to kind of go back and forth, and then that links back to availability. But you can always just hang up on them, I suppose.
That would be one possibility.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, but I think this speaks in part, Nolan, and to the fact, I mean, this is the fourth point that we got here, that this is not going to go away fast.
No.
Now, this is not a Q2 problem.
No.
We're looking at,
No.
We're looking realistically at fourth quarter here before things start to get any semblance of normalcy back to what we're looking to have in our lives. So if you can begin to habituate this rapid prototyping, if you can begin to habituate different behaviors, different ways of interacting, different ways of relating, when we do emerge out of this, you now have a toolbox of new tools that you can go to market with and that your people can actually organize around that were different than what you had before. And that's huge. That's huge.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. This is the kind of that, I've got it in my notes. One of the two of us said this the other day, was about focus on agility, not correctness, right? Agility is going to be, and I'm watching this with some clients and with other organizations where we're seeing new lines of business emerge out of this challenge that we're all facing around COVID and coronavirus. And as new lines of business emerge, which is important, right? Because people have got to focus on keeping not shutter their doors. But as these new lines of business are going, these are also lines of business that probably when the needle does reset, whenever that's Q4, Q3, Q1, whenever that is, as it goes out into the future, will remain a component of their portfolio of services. These are things that will enhance future state services. So when you're thinking about that,
and that's one of the reasons that you and I, decided we were going to do this, because just speak to my own business model. The consulting work I do and the training work I do requires being in front of groups of people, in real time. That isn't happening right now.
Yeah.
So, what does this make possible for me? Well, it makes possible reinventing my business model. And when things do get back to some semblance of normal, I now have something additional that I could do that I wasn't doing before. And interestingly, I now have, because of having to be in, what's the term? Not retired in place. What are we doing right now?
Master.
We're sitting in place, whatever that is.
I call it house arrest, but I'm not sure that's an appropriate tone for the conversation that we're having. Yeah. So.
but I'm finding I'm writing more. I'm actually being more creative right now. I've got time to do some of that stuff that I didn't. It was probably there before, but
there you go. Dan, shelter in place. Thank you, Dan.
Shelter in place. Thank you, Dan. Yes.
Thank God you're here, dude.
Yes, you're sheltered in place in that lovely home of yours with a gorgeous wine cellar, I might add.
That's not bad.
But this idea of, it's not a Q2 problem.
No.
This notion of time becomes really relevant because all of a sudden now we've got time in a different way. We've got time to work with in a different way. And this is something that I think is important for your people to understand as well. Now, they will have immediate needs. We all have immediate needs that need to be addressed. And it is an and. What can we do with this gift of time that we now have? And I really do kind of look at it as a gift of time in one way. I'm not as tethered to a place or a clock as I was 3 weeks ago.
Right.
As an example.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think, kind of for the sake of time, I think we'll kind of barge on to the. So we know, right? And I think across the board, I don't know that there's anybody on the call that would dispute this. We're hoping that this is a Q2 challenge for the virus itself. Right? There are viruses today around a potential. Some medications and some things that are being developed that are currently going through FDA testing and all of that stuff. I'm not a doctor, not official. Don't take my word for it. However, but from a financial perspective, because the needle has been reset, right? The needle now has gone from over in the green over into the red on how we do business and how we proceed forward. One of the things that's a component of this whole issue around financial implications is to focus on liquidity first. And we tend to come from, both Blaine and I come from a place of working with clients on growth tactics, growth strategies. How do you grow your team? How do you fix your culture? How do you scale your business? What do you do? What's that like? And that challenge in doing that. And it's a little bit of a different, I'll use the word, it's a little overused sometimes, but it's a little bit of a different paradigm when now mixed into it, which should always be, but now really severely mixed into it, is that conversation around liquidity first, which ties back to being agility and not being correct.
Yeah.
So it's really critically important that you do things like manage your cash, manage your terms of payments, reinforce your relationships with your vendors so that you understand your vendor stance. As a matter of fact, to your point, Blaine, as you mentioned, that Ford is shuttering the plants, right? Well, it's interesting because Ford doesn't make all the parts.
Right.
They assemble most of the parts, and most of the parts are made elsewhere. The lion's share of any car that you ever buy is not made by the manufacturer. It's made by small companies who feed those parts into the manufacturer, and it gets assembled into the larger parts.
And what that, I kind of go back to the beginning here, it's all about relationship. So yeah, there's relationship with these entities, but there's also the relationship that we have with our cash. And this is going to sound perhaps a bit awkward or unusual, not awkward necessarily, but this is not a question of accumulation. It's a question of distribution. Yeah, if we see ourselves, if we see our companies as centers of distribution of service, distribution of product, but also distribution of fiscal resources, we want to be mindful of just that, of how that distribution process is actually set up. So to the point that you're making, Dolan, about connecting with your vendors, your suppliers, that sort of thing. Yeah, it's a relationship. Everybody's kind of swimming in the same sea right now, and pretty much in the same boat. So back to Marcus Aurelius's statement that I opened with here, this is a question of how we address our humanity. So we want to connect. We want to have conversation, and relationships live in conversation. And so, we've got a fiscal resource that we want to husband. It's not about accumulation. It's not about hoarding. This isn't toilet paper. But we want to be able to find ways to have it being distributed in a way that keeps us viable, as well as doesn't do harm unnecessarily to others that are in our sphere of influence. And that's a big deal. That is a big deal, because when we come through this on the backside, you still have these relationships. And you still have these relationships that are going to either support or move away from you as a consequence of how you've approached this.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that there's some power. One of the things that comes out of that, I think that's a challenge for all of us, is even as things are shuttered and there's a change in the general business stance kind of across the board for everybody, both vendors and client customers and ourselves with our companies, those relationships become even more paramount for us to maintain those relationships and maintain them not only from a formal manner, but even anecdotally. Just a text to a vendor that you may be working with that says, "Hey, I'm thinking about you, and I hope things are well, and I want you to know that as this settles out, we're here." So a lot of the things that we can do don't have to be formal, high-level bits of effort. It can be a 2-second voice recording that goes out to somebody offering encouragement, and those relationships in turn pay off dramatically over time.
And it's not a give to get sort of a thing. It's not a trade. No. I mean, this is, you're coming from a position of genuine concern here. And the point that you just make about this, Dolan, Cynthia, my wife, copied me on an email she sent to one of our favorite restaurateurs here. I'm up on Whidbey Island in Seattle right now, where we're sheltering in place. And it's a small restaurant, but it's a wonderful little boutique restaurant. And we've gotten to know the owner fairly well, and she just texted him or sent an email saying, "We're thinking of you. If there's anything that we can do, let us know. We're kind of here for you." And he texted back saying, "It's great to know I'm not in this by myself." And he knew that intellectually, but that kind of reaching out, center of distribution. How can we leave people with the experience of uplift? in terms of their interactions with us. That is a key point, I think, to attend to.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be fiscal in that sense, but when we're looking at liquidity, most people will default to thinking just about money, but you've got goodwill here. And the liquidity of your goodwill is important as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, very much so.
And actually, we're talking about this, the sixth point here, which is staying close to your clients.
Right.
And that includes your customers and everything else that are in that universe.
Right. Well, and it goes back also to staying close means be available. Because
Yep.
if we're going through turmoil, they're going through turmoil. I think the last little topic is, we've touched on it across the board, and we kind of have a harsh topic for it in here, which is adapt or die. And to me, it's and Blaine kind of glanced across it, but there's a term I was explaining to Blaine a couple of days ago that came from an old mentor of mine, and some of you will recognize this name, a guy named Ray Norda. And Ray used to coin this phrase around co-opetition, that there is no competition, that there's really only cooperation between would-be or supposedly competitors, and he used co-opetition as his term. And this is a time, really, I think, for all of us, kind of in the concluding thoughts before we kind of open out to Q&A, is it's an opportunity for us to step back and look at our business and look at it through a fresh lens, and almost as if it's day one again, because it really is kind of day one again, where we can step back and say, okay, if I had a chance to really do it all over again, what would that look like, and how would I adapt my strategy and my thought process? Yeah,
and it's the idea that amateurs compete, professionals don't.
That's perfect.
And so going out of our way to find new ways, this is the adaptation piece. Who can I partner with? Who can we collaborate with? Who can we co-create with? And then how do we coordinate that movement as we go to market, as we do whatever it is that we're doing out there? But the idea of collaboration, co-opetition.
I'm not sure what that means, but that's it.
But it's antitrust laws notwithstanding. This is an important piece to look at, because adaptability is going to be what allows us to survive and thrive. It's not survival of the fittest, and all of you are familiar with what's attributed to Darwin. He didn't say it. He was talking about being adaptable. The adaptable are the ones that live. So that's what we're looking at doing here. There's a lot of ways from leadership perspectives that we want to pay attention to, starting with examining your mindset. What is it that you bring to the table? Inappropriate competition, and if you're a business leader, you've got competition hardwired into your DNA. But inappropriate competition will kill the market and kill the business faster than just about anything I can think of. Inappropriate competition. Cooperative is what we want to look for here. And finding there's a number of folks on this call masterminding. Just how do we do this? Well, form a mastermind. Find some folks. Get 3 or 4 people together, and just sit down. Dolan and I started this 3 years ago. Over Eggs Benedict. Full circle here at a little cafe just outside of Marina Del Rey, and about once every 2 to 4 weeks, we'd get together for Eggs Benedict and have a 2-hour, sometimes a 3-hour.
Until they ran us out.
Conversation, and a lot of notes, got generated on napkins. And
yes, I should pull that napkin out.
Get the napkins. So, but this is an idea here. So the 7 points, mindset and leadership. Put your mask on first. Get familiar with what's going on here. Clarity and candor. How do you communicate? What do you communicate about? 80% rule. It doesn't have to be certain. It's just probability. Move into possibility here. This is going to be around for a while. It's not a Q2 problem. This idea of liquidity, yes, it's about fiscal resources, money, but it's also about goodwill, and it's about a number of other things that you want to be husbanding, coming from a position of a center of distribution. Staying close. You cannot over communicate here. Yeah, and that's the note that we have here is stay close to your clients. It really is stay close to everybody.
Yeah.
Communicate, 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 and then finally you're going to be looking at adapting through the process here. So that's kind of the roadmap that we've just navigated. Why don't we open the mics up?
That's a lot of navigation.
That is.
So what I'd like to do is, I think for us, it's just, if you'd like to come off of mute and ask a question, throw your hand in the air and we'll pop you off of mute. That way we don't have a bunch of folks trying to do it all at once. And then we can take some questions for a bit and just chat. We'd love to have, if there's questions and you want to put them into the chat, both Blaine and I have the chat up on the screen now, but we're here to do this with y'all for just a little bit more. And I don't know if anybody wants to. I don't know if any victims.
I see one here from
I
Jim.
see one up there.
Yeah, Jim Lemming. I'll just go work from the bottom up here. Jim's question. Okay. Issue attending to teams remotely is we can't see all the cues coming from the perturbation in the system. Feelings are important and need to be shared. How can we help our teams learn those cues or signals, and more importantly, to reveal them? I think that's a great question.
Good. That's a good one, Jim.
If you're, and this has been my experience with this, Jim, when you're communicating remotely, ideally you'll have a Zoom conference or a Skype conference where you've got some video feed in play. Some of this you're going to just have to calibrate because this is not something that we are used to doing.
Right.
Yeah, only about in the Alfred Morabian studies on this, 7% of the communication is contained in the actual words, 93% is in the other domains. You start asking questions. It's kind of like you didn't sound quite certain about that, and so you ask questions, and the questions aren't about pinning people down as much as they are as for bringing things to the surface because they may not be aware of it themselves. So I find that the use of questions in these sorts of environments goes a lot further than being declarative and directive. Yeah. Kind of checking back in before you close the meeting. Kind of go around the table. What have you heard us talk about? What are your feelings about what we've just shared? Everybody clear about the for the sake of what? I mean, those sorts of things. You start the meetings become as much about how are we doing as they are about what are we doing.
Right. Yeah, there's a couple of things I'll insert in that thought too. That's a great question, Jim, because the challenge with managing remote teams is we're accustomed to, we've grown up in a culture, and at least Blaine and I have. I think he's got more gray hair than I do, but we've grown up in a culture where we're accustomed from a work perspective to gather at the water cooler, at the coffee pot, or in my cube, or in my office, and so we can have that kind of physical interaction. So a couple of things that I've done over the years with my remote teams is I've enforced at least an 80% of the time video on conversation. So if you come to the call, I'd like you to have video on. Now there's always situations where that may not necessarily be possible, and for lots of reasons we don't need to get into all of that, but I think that also helps. There's two things that happen. As a leader, it helps us understand that individual's participation, but as that individual on the call, they know that we're in it. I don't know if we've ever had bosses that were narcoleptic. I had a boss that was narcoleptic once for about 3 years, and every time we'd be in a meeting, inevitably he would drift off, and we would just sneak out of the room and move the meeting down the hall. So it's important that you take those kinds of steps to give everybody a chance to feel like they're part of it. Like you, great comment. I also find it's very transparent about the nature of our feeling signals. Yeah, we are creatures, by the way, without getting into triune brain theory and blah, 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 all that stuff. We are creatures where within 7 seconds, I know whether you're going to be hostile or not just by looking into your eyes, where your hands are, and where your teeth are. So it's important that we take all those things into consideration. But really good point without elaborating much further. So.
Yeah, Lynn Tarosian has got a question here specific to the healthcare environment, which is, can you comment on thoughts around those leading in healthcare that don't have most of what you're discussing? They are still at work and have amazing challenges. Lynn, could you come off mute for just a moment? I'd like to know from you what you think they don't have that we could address.
Right.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
First. Okay. So what I was referring to is like, I mean, I think about, for example, a physician leader who's still leading a team, and the team is not facing the challenges that you're describing. In other words, they're still there. They're in the midst of this with dealing with the virus actually coming at them, the patients actually coming at them. And is there anything, it might be, the answer you have might be no, but is there anything that you would suggest differently about any of these 7 or 8 things that you've talked about for people who are really like at the front line? It's almost like if we're fighting a war, you know, these are the people at the front line instead of the people back at the headquarters.
Yeah. I think, this is an answer. I'm not suggesting that it's the answer by any means, but there's the risk of PTSD here.
Exactly.
And so having people have an environment where they can at least feel as if they're being listened to, that their concerns are being heard. They may not be able to be addressed immediately. And it can, sometimes just be something as simple as a safe place that they can let down emotionally for a little bit. Now, how that gets set up is going to be highly situational. I mean, if a physician leader opted to do that, but I think it's really kind of like a triage situation, obviously. And what you're looking to do here is manage the stress level. It has to have an outlet. Otherwise it can be very debilitating, and quality of care will be impacted. Not surprisingly. So I'm not sure that that's helpful, but it's one size doesn't fit all with this. I know that there are a couple of folks in here that have medical backgrounds that may be more qualified to answer that than I can. But I know that from just a pure leadership perspective, when people feel heard, I mean, truly feel heard, it takes a lot of pressure off them to prove, because people will tend to want to prove the point that I'm not being listened to unless they feel as if they've been heard. They will want to prove the point that it's not working right until they've been heard. And once they can feel as if they've been heard, that opens up space for something else to be present, and a different possibility, perhaps.
Yeah, I think
is that useful, Lynn?
Yes, and I was thinking about I guess I was particularly struck by the idea of this is happening to me versus this is happening for me, and I think when I think about people in the healthcare setting, I don't know how to help them understand anything other than this is happening to me. And so I think it's maybe, and I like what Matt G, I don't know who Matt G is, but I like what he said, that I think it's about acceptance of, we're in a situation. And so rise above the tendency to be woe is me and sink into victim, and rise above that and say, well, this certainly isn't happening for our benefit, but our mission still is to take care of people, and this is how we do it. And so I think what you said about the safe space, Blaine, is probably really helpful. I think all these people, they've got a family to worry about too. I mean, we've got, you think about healthcare workers, they're like having to go home and take a shower before they can even enter their home, or separating. So I think that's a great idea. Thank you very much.
You bet. Marcus Aurelius, and this is not attributed to Marcus Aurelius, actually. This is, I think, attributed to Cato, the Stoic philosophy. There are things that are completely outside of our control. Anything that is going on external to us, we have no control over, and to get my knickers in a knot because it's going on the way that it's going on doesn't serve me well. The only thing that I actually have control over, literally, are my thoughts, my feelings, and my behaviors. Those are the only 3 things I ever have control over. And if I can organize my mindset, or just organize myself around, How am I thinking? How I think determines how I feel. How I feel drives my behavior. So I want to start with my thinking first, my mindset first. This is why, as a leader, you want to put your mask on first. And then you start taking a look at, this is emotional intelligence. What's the source of that emotion? Where's that coming from? Is it a valid emotion to be having at this point in time? Am I attributing it to something that it doesn't need to be attributed to? And then what behavior? Viktor Frankl talks about this, the pause between stimulants and response. There's that little gap there. Most of us tend to be highly reactive in the face of unexpected stimulus. We want to have a space that we can just kind of take a breath and then choose a response that allows us to be as generative as we can. And there's no guarantees with any of it, but it comes back to I have control over thoughts, feelings, emotions, and behavior. Everything else, it's going to be what it's going to be.
So. Yeah, very true. I have nothing to contribute to that.
Eggs Benedict for everybody.
Other than Lynn, just my only thought is first of all, we have adopted this term over the last decade of first responders, or decade and a half, right, for first responders, and now it's these individuals these are our first responders. These are the folks on the front line. So I do agree with Blaine. I think there are, and I'm not a psychologist by any way, but there are things that will be PTSD-like with what they're trying to deal with, and I think approaching them with kind of some of the preventative methods that can sit in front of PTSD would be certainly worth investigating and spending some time in. So other than that, I'll stay out of it.
Yeah, I'm paying attention to our clock here, so I want to be mindful of everybody's time. We had said that this would be approximately an hour.
On the hour. So a couple of then that's my cue for my closing thoughts for a couple things. All right. So I'm going to drop into the chat a link that will go out to a page, and Mr. Bartlett has gracefully made available for everybody that's on this call with us today, and for those who registered for the call who will listen to the recording, a copy of his book, which I've read and spent some time inside of, which is a 52-week treatise on leadership mindset, which is just outstanding. It's 52 weeks that walks you through multiple zones of how to be an outstanding leader. And you'll also see on there, not that, and I hate to disappoint everybody, but we got nothing to sell you. You'll see a link on there that says, hey, look, if you want to chat with us, you can click the chat button. It schedules a 20-minute call. Either Blaine or I will pick the call up, or chances are we'll both show up, and then there's no way in hell it'll be a 20-minute call. So the big thing that I'll tell all of you is, just from my heart, is just two things. Is first and foremost, thank you for taking time to be here, even though we're all shuttered in place. And or sheltered in place, sorry,
or shuttered, yeah,
house arrest. I'm not sure. And the second part of it is just be safe. Be safe mentally. Be safe physically. Do those things. So, and take care of your loved ones, Mr. Bartlett.
Oh, just thank every one of you for attending. It was kind of an interesting experiment for both Dolan and I was very gratified to see who was on this call. Some some people that are very close, that I'm very close to. So it's good to see you guys here. Do get a copy of the book. It just came out, literally, and it's called Leadership Mindset Weekly, and it's a 52 weekly practices that are organized very specifically to, have you work with your mindset as a leader, being more generative, more productive, more creative, more intuitive, whatever the case may be. So, it's a PDF copy. You use it to your heart's content. And if you've got some feedback on it, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about it. Like I said, it just literally came out. And I say when it came out, you're the ones that it's coming out to. So,
all right.
Go ahead, and bless you. Keep yourself safe. Keep your family safe, and shelter well.
On that note, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.